All right, I am going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone on this beautiful, properly spring evening. My name is Ali Mullen, and I am with the Oswego Lake Watershed Council. We are one of two hosts this evening for the Soil Talk. Co-hosting, we have the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, LOSN. And before handing things over to our fabulous speaker, I'll just share a quick background for the Oswego Lake Watershed Council and LOSN for those attendees who are joining us from other parts of Portland and Oregon. It's obvious from our poll that we have people here with a variety of backgrounds with us tonight, so welcome. The Oswego Lake Watershed Council is a locally organized stewardship nonprofit established to improve the condition and health of the Oswego Lake watershed and its stream network. In our work protecting local urban ecosystems, we work alongside the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, a volunteer-run organization with the purpose of promoting sustainable practices in Lake Oswego, with the long-term goal to create a safe and healthy environment for this community and future generations. This is done through the triple bottom line of environmental stewardship, prosperity, and social equity. As we kick off this event, I also just want to ground us in a land acknowledgement. The land we now call home, Lake Oswego, Oregon, is the ancestral home of and land of the Tualatin, Atfalati band of the Kalapuyan tribe, Clackamas bands of the Upper Chinook and other native groups. Their tribal members today are represented by the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and other indigenous groups. Indigenous people successfully lived and cared for this land since time immemorial, prior to European colonization, and continue to do so today. We acknowledge and mourn the loss of life and way of living in harmony with all creation. We seek to respectfully listen, learn, and apply Indigenous knowledge to the healing of the land and all beings who interact with the Oswego Lake watershed. We commit to building relationships and advancing environmental justice. Just a couple of housekeeping items to share before I turn it over to Cuauhtemoc. We are recording this talk and it will be available on the LOSN YouTube channel and will also be sent out to everyone who has registered for this event. So if you end up missing any chunk of tonight or want to come back to it, that will be available. We will have Cuauhtemoc speaking for about 30 minutes or so, followed by a quick 10-minute breakout room session before we have our Q&A. I also want to give a special thanks to the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, who provides grants to organizations to support urban conservation and education and is supporting this event. So for the past few years, Oswego Lake Watershed Council has been exploring ways to demonstrate soil as the foundation of life on Earth. And we have been working with residents of Lake Oswego on developing a long-term study of microorganism health in the urban soil of Lake Oswego backyards, parks, schoolyards, churches, etc. And every April, we provide educational activities to engage the community with healthy soil and develop practices to heal and nurture their own backyard ecosystems. You may have heard of the Soil Your Undies campaign challenge, and I'll provide a bit more information about that experiment at the end of this talk. But tonight we have the pleasure of having Cuauhtemoc Villa, who has been doing a lot of amazing work demystifying soil ecosystems and educating and empowering folks to better visualize and support these ecosystems. He is with us here tonight to discuss the role of microorganism bioactivity and sustainable ecology, as well as different tactics we can adopt on a local level to improve the bioremediation of the land. Some background on Cuauhtemoc: he is a Taino, Aztec, and Mayan living soil educator and regenerative farmer. He is a friend of the microbes, a student of their ancient wisdom, and a teacher of their ways. For over 20 years, Cuauhtemoc has partnered with the microbes using Bokashi, biochar, and compost teas to grow resilient plants and bioremediate land and water. Cuauhtemoc is passionate about remembering and restoring Indigenous agricultural ways and tribal ecological knowledge to honor land, ancestors, and future generations. He shares these practices with people of all ages and backgrounds through school garden programs, online and hands-on workshops, conferences, and consultations with farmers and growers across the world. And he will share a bit about that in his presentation. Cuauhtemoc's commitment to healing with the land has also led him to work extensively in conservation, serving for years as an educator for Sonoma Ecology Center and Sonoma Biochar Initiative. Most recently, he has partnered with Sound Native Plants to lead teams in building microbial and biochar enhanced native plant bioswales for stormwater management and waterway remediation in Portland, Oregon. He currently works on the Topaz Farm on Wapato Island, also known as Savi Island, where he is helping oversee a large-scale transition from conventional to regenerative farming practices, implementing microbial and biochar techniques, and centering community participation and education. His mission to continue to build co-creative partnerships between humans and the soil to heal and restore our loving earth. So without further ado, I will go ahead and hand things over to you, Cuauhtemoc, and we will reconvene after your presentation.
All right, thank you for that beautiful introduction and for the land acknowledgement of Lake Oswego Watershed. We made this presentation from Wapato Island, as she mentioned. This is a band of the Multnomah people, the Chinook people, where they cultivated a special plant called Wapato. This native plant is like a potato root, and it had very strong nutritional values. So we like to honor the people who farmed here first and the ones who continue to farm here, and hope that they can do it in a good way. Where's my screen jump? Okay, I am talking from Ground Culture is the latest business I'm working from, and I'm working with Ray Hart, who without her computer technology skills and her background as a nurse brings such a unique background to bring regenerative farming to the community, because it's just not what we call backyard science, which is where I learned this stuff from. So a lot of you guys doing backyard stuff, this is where I got it from. And loving my backyard, then expanding to loving the kids' garden, the school garden, and then expanding out to the rivers and where I'm at today. So don't think that what you're doing in your backyard is not important. This is exactly where I've come from. And I'm glad to partner with people who know how to work with technology and modern science like Ray Hart, so we can bring this to you with two different Indigenous background and also medicinal background from modern science. Okay, so we're going to cover in this talk a little bit about working with microbiology and how to use microbes to restore regenerative farming and watershed management, ecological restoration. We hope that we can shine light on how fungi, bacteria regenerate these environments, as well as fire. Fire is a big part of regenerative farming, just like water is. So we hope that we can shine more light on that. Now, if we think back to early planet Earth and how our Earth got started, this wasn't a happy place. It was very toxic. It had CO2, methane gases. It was hot, and there wasn't a lot of microorganisms here, but there were some microorganisms here. And there's certain microorganisms that were able to thrive in these kinds of environments, that by them converting the CO2, the methane, and being able to live in volcanic heat, they then were gassing off oxygen. So when we think about regenerative, we want to think about how these processes were done by nature naturally. So when we think back to Mother Earth, we got to think about, well, what microbes were there that were doing the regenerative work, and which ones are here now, continuing the process. Back in early life, there would have been a microbe called purple non-sulfur bacteria. This is going to be a key microbe, big name, but basically, you know this from Swiss cheese. It's what makes the big bubbles in Swiss cheese, because it creates a lot of oxygen. So keeping in mind, there's microbes that were able to live in toxic environments, consume toxic compounds, live off of heat, and basically it's phototrophic. This purple non-sulfur bacteria is one of the main pivotal points where life would have regenerated. Now, when we think about fire and carbon, this particular microbe is still alive today, and it's alive in the carbon, and it's alive in the fires. When you think about the forest having a regenerative power, without that fire coming through, a lot of things don't grow. So when you look at the fire left behind, this is what you're going to see. This honeycomb structure of carbon is exactly where microorganisms are going to live. Not only microorganisms are going to live, but it's going to hold nutrients, it's going to hold their food, it's going to hold their water, but it also has electrical capacity. When we think of soil and when we are growing plants, you got to imagine like we're drawing energy from that. Having this kind of carbon in the soil is like being able to recharge your battery. So these kinds of processes is how the earth formed. So the organisms formed around that process as well. So this is why when Native people always would set fires to create their foods. Now we're learning in conservation how important the fires are. But this is why, when you look at it closely, why the fires were so important. So the benefits of fire, we call that now biochar when you look at when we're using fire or a component of the fire in regenerative farming or in conservation. And that's because those little honeycomb structures, they're holding water, they're holding microbial life, both fungi and bacteria. And more importantly, that little microbial that I talked about, that purple non-sulfur bacteria, it's going to live in there as well because it has that electron capacity, and it's just a very happy place for it to continue to do its work. It's an adsorption property for nutrients. This is where things can stick to it. So when we have nutrient runoff, if we can have adsorption, that you're going to have a stickiness happening on that char, where then those microbes who are finding residence on that char, they can have food. It's going to raise the EC potential of the soil. This is what basically is recharging the soil so it can become regenerative. And not only that, when you're creating the biochar, you're sequestering the carbon. As the fire burns, that honeycomb structure that you saw in the picture before, it's basically it's 80–60% carbon when we call it biochar. So being able to lock that in the soil means it's not gassing off in the air. So we're able to lock that up for regenerative processes. And this is something that we can do during our fuel reduction processes that we're already doing on our land management. And we usually are burning that stuff down to ash, but by learning how to convert that into biochar, you're going to be able to use that back into the regenerative process of your soil, but it's all part of the fuel reduction system. And essentially what it's doing is it's carbon. So just like on your phones and computers, it's made from silica. Silica is a form of carbon that can hold information. So nature's no different when it builds itself, and that information is stored within the carbon structure of that burnt wood. And the information of that carbon, of that wood, is what's passed on to the region of that new succession that's growing. So it's going to pass on to that little seedling all of the things that work with that plant. It's like having a parent or a grandparent forever stored with knowledge in that soil and that carbon. So when we're storing data in char, we're basically storing the knowledge of the forest, what microbes partnered with that forest to make those plants grow, what macro species are partnered with that. It's all stored in there, just like your phone can retrieve data. The data within the carbon's very similar. Now, when we convert that carbon biomass, there's so many ways that we can do it. Traditionally, down on that left side, you're going to see a burn pile. That's how we convert most of our waste material on land management sites or restoration sites. But I'm going to teach you a little bit different way on how to convert your burn pile so that we can capture that carbon. If you wanted to capture more of the carbon, then you're going to try to reduce the oxygen being exposed to that biomass. So you can see things like the ring of fire kiln. These are things developed by a forester, Kelpie Wilson, and currently being tested so that we can use these things on no burn days. because what it does is it captures all of that smoke, which traditionally goes up into the air. The smoke is actually combustible. So these ring of fire kiln technology is an amazing way to convert biomass. And then you have things like the atom retort. And the atom retorts, you can see, completely block out the oxygen. So your conversion rates are going to be much higher. And then you're able to use the heat for different applications, like heating greenhouses and things like that. But there's different ways to do the conversions depending on cost. So one of these may apply to your situation. We'll cover those in the next slide. Now on fuel reduction, when we collect our biomass, they can just be, your standard burn piles and yard prunings, whether we're doing forest management. The way that we collect our biomass now, instead of just burning them down, now we got to think of that as a fuel source for creating these microbial homes within the carbon content. So a lot of these practices we're already doing. So now by applying the different techniques on how to burn the biomass means that we can capture more carbon. You're going to see in these pictures that fire is lit from the top. And when you light the fire from the top instead of the bottom, you're able to release the gases from the biomass so that just its carbon skeletons left behind. Most of the fires were lighting down at the bottom, but by top lighting the fire, you're able to then create a large amount of heat and then draw the smoke, which traditionally goes up in the air, goes right back into that flame front. And when the smoke hits the fire, that's going to drive your temperature even higher. High temperature is what we're looking for in a good biomass conversion. You can see that the fire lit from the top, it's going to burn a little bit different than you may be used to from coming from the bottom. It's going to work its way down. I advise you to do smaller piles at first to get the skill set down. But once that fire consumes the biomass and you start to get a beautiful white coat of ash, the ash is an indicator that the carbon now is being oxidized by oxygen. So we want to think about quenching that fire at that point so that we can capture the carbon and we're not losing it to oxidation, which means going all to ash. Let me see here. I got the next slide coming up. Different biomass is going to burn at different rates. Some of this stuff is vineyard composites, prunings, and whether it goes in the kiln or whether you're just doing a pile burn, it's going to be completely different. But that's why I advise you to learn the fire behavior pattern of the fire so that you can learn exactly when to quench that fire to capture the most amount of biomass. You're looking at about a 5% or 15% capture rate of the biomass that you start with when you're doing the kiln conversions. And yeah, so when you're blocking out, so the burn piles, you're just going to light that thing and let them burn down. But then when you get into the kiln technology, they're great because then you can continually put feedstock into the kilns and create more biochar because you're feeding the fire. So traditionally, where like your burn piles, it may take, half a day, several days to burn down. By lighting them at the top, these are going to take several hours now to burn down. So you're going to be able to convert that much quicker. When I find that part where the ash is starting to cover a lot of the biomass, that's when I want to cool the fire down. And that's what I want to, because that's when I'm going to capture the char. You're going to notice now there's going to be different pieces. I'll have a lot of char converted into small pieces, but there's still a bunch of big pieces that's not converted. These can go into the next burn, but at this point, I'm going to try to quench the fire. A lot of people push dirt on top, but when I quench the fire now, that's going to put it out completely and then allow me to then capture the biochar that I'm going to use for the garden. Depends how big of a pile you're going to do. Down in Napa, we're doing huge giant piles, so the big water tank's necessary. But most of the time, the water hoses You can see even there's 2 water hoses on the ones at Topaz because it takes so long, but you want to be able to quench that fire. Make sure it's cooled all the way. Rake it out because there's times where you think it's cool, but down in the bottom, it's still going to have its heat and still trying to burn. The finished char should look like glass. When you touch that char, there should be very little black on your fingers. It should crisp and be glassy, almost translucent rainbow appearance in the char. This is going to tell me that the volatile gases are exited from the carbon, and I have that beautiful honeycomb structure ready to go. So you've seen that in some of those pictures I used a kiln or a burn pile. You can also dig a pit. There's some very nice pit technologies done out of Japan called tiki kon pits, where you can just always have these pits going. And you know, you can make great char from the pits. They're one of my favorites. When we use biochar out on the farm, I usually run it about 5 to 15% with my compost. And I do like a top dress amendment with that material. As I water in my plants, that char trickles down into the soil. Then when I'm planting and doing transitions, the char goes further down. But typically, if I can keep 5 to 15% in my compost every time I'm adding in, you know, we're even adding in compost during the growing season, depending on the stages of the plant. I know I'm constantly getting char in there and it's building itself over time. And since there's tons of biomass during the farming process, it seems to go hand in hand. But those are about the ratios that we've had great success. When you look at where biochar was discovered in the Terra Preta pits of the Amazon, those dudes are running like 20%, so way higher. But this is what I've had with great success. We're using, if you're just doing in the hole, say you have your plants, your rows already set, you can pull out an X amount of soil, mix the char in 5 to 10%, and then put your plants right in the holes there with the char. We want the roots to have contact with that char because that char is going to have a lot of water holding capacity. So you could also just put it in the holes. We're using the char too in the husbandries and in animal feeds. So in the animal feeds, if you went in with the chickens and cows, about 1 to 5%, it's just like you eating activated carbon. It's going to keep their stomachs in balance, especially with the cows with a lot of stomachs, that when they get the diarrhea and things, the biochar always seems to help their stomachs with a little bit of molasses every single time. So, you know, when you call the poison control center and you're sick, this is what they're going to issue you to eat. So this is an amazing thing for the animals. And then down in the pens, I'm throwing down 3 to 5% where they're dropping their waste, where it gets stinky, where the chickens are doing their excrements. But you're going to have those ammonias that usually gas up into the air, now adsorb to the char and really reduce the nitrogen smells that we have in there, typically that we get from the animal waste. And then once your animals poop on it, it's charged up. So it's even better to use in your garden because it has all the benefits from the animal droppings, but it's broken down in a more favorable way. That's not a low pH methane kind of a way. So you'll have some amazing animal droppings where it would be typically gross before. Now you're really going to like it. We do a lot of consultations and trainings on how to make biochar through ground culture. I kind of burn through it quick, but if you want more details and want to learn for your specific site or agency, man, we'd love to come out and teach you. Now, a lot of this stuff, tribal ecological knowledge, we have talked about the biochar. These are things that we learned from the Amazon. And there's a lot of things from indigenous cultures, not just from native cultures, but European cultures, African cultures, Asian cultures, where we're bringing in and we're learning how to fix the system, because there was a sense of balance between these indigenous cultures. And that's because they always had a sense of watching nature instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and making these new amendments or medicines. You just watch how nature works. You see what the bear eats, or you see why the fish come to a certain place, and you try to mimic those things. And these are really our like our universities for indigenous cultures. It's going to the wild places and watching how nature works. So a lot of this stuff, watching the charcoal, how it regenerated the forest, is why the indigenous cultures of the Amazon started to bring them into their food production systems knowing the benefits they have on the plants. Now, when we're talking about regenerative farming, there's one particular indicator species that I always look at when I do consultations. I go out and look at soils, and this is the worm. And that's because the worm, inside the belly of the worm, is that special bacteria I talked about earlier, that purple non-sulfur bacteria. Whoa. And when you have that worm in the soil, I know the soil's, on a good health. When they're absent, I know something's going on. And that's because of the excrements coming from this little guy. It's really like a carrier for this special microbe, this purple non-sulfur bacteria, that it has the ability to consume toxic compounds. So when we're dealing with bioremediation, we may want to employ this little guy. It has the ability to eat from sunlight, which means you don't need to feed it. It's just like a phototrophic, like a plant would be. It can eat carbohydrates like typical microorganisms, but what's also very good about this little microbe is it can eat gases like CO2, just like it did in the early planet stages. And when it eats up that gas, it gases off oxygen. So if we're thinking about converting our planet back to an oxygen-rich environment, these are the natural things that live within our systems that we got to think about re-employing back into our programs. It lives at the edges of ponds, in the rocky sediments. This thing's everywhere. So it's not like something that needs to be reintroduced or genetically modified. It's already been here. There's a lot of ways that we can create compost teas where we can employ this little super microbe, where we don't have to buy the thing. The worm castings itself, right? So a lot of times I take 1 part worm castings, and then I take the kombucha. The kombucha I like because it has the lactic acid bacteria. Now we know the kombucha is good for your belly, but when you think about soil and humans are not much different. There's a lot of things that are good for soil that's good for humans. So lactic acid bacteria, if you think about their job and what they do with pickling and keeping pathogens away from food as it sits there suspended, they love to keep things clean. So by adding 1 part worm casting, 1 part kombucha, sometimes I'll put those worm castings into an old sock or something, and I can squeeze the little stuff out of that thing. But I'll make a tea out of that, and then 20 parts water. Make a tea out of that, squeeze that little sucker real good. But this is your basic feeding that you can have for your plants, that then you can get all of the beneficial microbes from without having to buy them. And they're alive. They're alive because they were just in the worm. You're alive because they just brewed the kombucha. So these are very good, cheap ways you can create your own compost tea that then you can then get into the gardens in different ways. Or if you're going to do weekly waterings, 1 to 3 tablespoons works great. When I got the job at Topaz, I took that little hose and sprayer. Now this is a 130-acre farm, you guys, but I took the hose and sprayer with the compost tea and I said, give me your worst row. And she did, and it made the plants look so good. I said, call me in a couple of weeks, see how they look. It took her about 3 days to call me back. So yeah, there's a lot of ways we can get this very simple tea, whether it's your watering can or you're using ag equipment like this. These are ag equipment that used to be used when it was Kruger Farm for pesticides. We now convert them into dropping compost teas. So there's many ways you can get them in. If you're doing a foliage spray on your plants to keep away powdery mildews or botrytis, which are known to get our pumpkins and things like that, you can go 1 teaspoon of water. You got to remember, these things are alive. So every 20 minutes, they're going to grow themselves. So we go very little with our mix in there and see how they react. Seeds and starch, you can go 1 teaspoon per gallon. Each little seed's going to have its own special microorganism they're related to. We call those endophytes. So these little microorganisms feed the organisms that are specific to each plant. So when you can nurture each little plant's microorganism that it comes with in the seed, then you can see where the immune system of that plant's going to be much different. So that's where these things are going to nurture the endophytes or the indigenous microbes native to the area. So they protect and nurture those things. Now, if you didn't want to make your own worm tea, there's guys that make this stuff. And then they contain all the purple non-sulfur bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, And they also include yeast that we know from beer and wine. When you're doing remediation jobs, they much rather have an inoculant that's been specified and regulated than, me mixing together warm compost teas. But there's companies that have created this thing. Dr. Taro Higa actually is a scientist from Japan who was hired by like a major corporation to find a special microbe that they can then patent as the silver bullet for regenerative organic farming and sell. And he couldn't find the one because every time he tried, it did not perform the same as it did in isolation, as it did in community. And he was so depressed about this, he was going to quit his job, had his head hung down and trying to figure out what to tell his boss. When he left the office on that particular day, depressed, he looked out the back door where he exited, where he would throw all of his samples out, and noticed there was a patch of grass there that was greener than the rest. And that's when it hit him. It wasn't in isolation these things work, but in community. So it changed his whole idea, and he went back to the lab, grabbed the collection of microbes and mixed them together. And microbiology at that time would not mix aerobic microbes that like air and anaerobic microbes that don't like air. They just, everything is like isolated and studied. But the dude went back and looked at it and saw like they need each other. They're self-supporting. One's, basically farting oxygen. The other one's farting CO2. And it created this mix. And that's how the consortia was born. But what's super cool about it is he did what most scientist communities do not do. And he went back and he ran it through the indigenous communities of Japan. Japan, as we know, the Asian cultures, they ferment everything. So there's a certain group of farmers there that do a lot of fermenting. He ran it through them and they authenticated the mix. And then not only did you have the science community approval, but you had the indigenous community approval. And I think that's why EM has had success the way it has worldwide, because it satisfied both grassroots and also the academic side. So it's on a mission right now. Okay, so when we talk about the EM cultures, they're, as I said, they're nothing more than just fermented foods. They have all these big microbial names, but they're the exact same thing that we're going to use for making, our beers and wine, the yeast. Yeast can convert organic matter quickly. So that's why they employ the yeast. When we're trying to break down our amendments quickly, it's the yeast that you want to do that. But it's also very messy. So you want the lactic acid bacteria that's like its mom, coming up after it, cleaning it, keeping the pathogens at bay, keeping all the bad things away. And then the things that those two can't handle, that's where that purple non-sulfur bacteria comes in, because it's able to then consume the toxic compounds that works very closely with the lactic acid bacteria and the yeast. Those probiotic cultures now being used over 20 years. They first started out in the garden, but now, they've expanded out into animal husbandry, giving them, it's like giving your animals yogurt, especially cows with all the stomachs they have. If you're not feeding them right, they're going to be unbalanced. And what comes out the back end is going to tear up the watershed. So being sure that you have those balances in nature, in their gut, balances that out. And then it went into pond care. A lot of we're learning, all these microbes came out of the water, but we don't think about the water as being microbial rich like we do soil. So when they started employing these into the waterways, we're able to see they don't actually take over, but they feed a lot of the indigenous microbes, we call them, that live there. And this is what blows a lot of the scientific mind, because you think typically when we plant a native species or something that they're there to take over the area, these just actually feed the native microbes, and you can't even find them once you slide them under the scope. So they're the catalyst, if you would, for regenerative farming. And then things like septic systems, you're able to then, the septic system is a digester, if you think about it, the way it processes all the waste. If it's done in a favorable way, you don't have the gassing off that's happening within the tank, and then those compounds are not released through the leach lines, keeping them in a neutral state as they reach the watershed. So yeah, there's a lot of many different ways that we can use the probiotic cultures. One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about the living soil was this Soil Your Undies challenge. And this is a great deal to kind of see like how soil digests things. right? This is South Valley Center over at Topaz Farm. We had the kids come by. This is one of their favorite things to do. But we're leaving ours in for 60 days to consume the underwear. But what I want you to think now, there's a process that we do. I was telling you in Asian cultures and their farming practices, they do a lot of things with fermentation. But we do this thing here where it's similar to soil your undies, but we don't bury underwear. Okay, what we're gonna do here is we're gonna bury rice, and this is a partially cooked rice in a box, because when we bury that rice, and what I want to do is pick a site where I can tell the microbes are rich. So where I'm from in Napa, there's a lot of times the vineyard blocks are just doing really good in some places, but poor in others. If I can plant one of these boxes down in the blocks where everything's growing good, it's like soil your undies. But what's happening here is all those microbes, I'm not going to leave them long enough to chew all the rice up, but I'm going to leave them long enough to capture them. So this is going to take about 9 to 13 days. If I can get a box of rice in the ground, cover that thing up, then I'm going to capture these little microorganisms, which when I plant that box, it's already an indicator by around me, the trees that's growing, the birds that's singing. You know, there may be water nearby with fish, but it's telling me like this thing is jamming with macro life. So it's got to have microbe life. So I want to try to trap them. So this is like bury your undies, but I'm only doing it for 9 to 13 days on this one. And then when I bury that rice down, all those microorganisms are going to jump onto that rice. And I got them now. So I usually leave behind some tobacco for thanking them for giving themselves to me. And then can mix them into my wood chip pile, as you see there. And they'll start to myceliate and convert, right? And I got them going there. I can throw them in compost pile, or on the left side, we do something really unique called make bokashi with them. And it's a way of fermenting them, but I don't have to wait as long as the compost pile, but then I can add them into my bokashi mixes. Bokashi is a Japanese word, and it means fermented organic matter. And we can use, whether I'm capturing the microbes or I'm using the liquid EM, it's basically meaning that I can take the microorganisms and put them on some kind of organic matter to grow them and culture them. And you can see here, I just used a bag for this particular one. But you mix once I can capture my microbes, whether it's in the microbe trap that I just showed you, or I'm using the inoculant liquid like you see there on the right, that's bubbly, I then can grow them. And the medium in which I use to ferment is that's my nutritional value that I got to think about. So if I'm trying to feed my plants, if I use a wheat bran compared to like a sawdust, you can see where the wheat bran, once fermented, is going to have a higher nutritional value than maybe some sawdust. So it's just a way of converting organic matter, growing microorganisms, but also delivering amendments as well. And when you look up Bokashi online, this is typically how it's used. They have a 5-gallon bucket in Japan. All the housing's very condensed. Everybody's on top of each other. So to deal with food waste, everybody gets these little 5-gallon buckets. What's cool about these 5-gallon buckets is you got a little spigot down at the bottom. You're able to drop in your food waste, including bones and meats now, because now you're adding in your bokashi. Your bokashi is a fermented grain or wood chip. And when you add your food waste into the bucket with the microorganisms, instead of taking your traditional breakdown path, you're now headed down a fermentation breakdown path. So there's no heat involved. It's not thermophilic. This is a completely different kind of break. It's a molecular breakdown that's super quick. So once I keep adding food waste into that bucket, I can ferment that food waste 2 weeks now. After 2 weeks of fermentation, molecularly, those little microbes from the bokashi have broke it down. And that little spigot down at the bottom is delivering me compost tea during the process. That compost tea you can use to water your plants, and it's going to be so nutrient rich. But what's cool is like the food waste going through the fermentation process. Now it's 2 weeks. Once it's broken down, I can then take it out into the garden and bury that food waste, cover it up, let that sit 2 weeks now, and then plant right on top. and all the food I'm gonna need for my plants is right underneath. There's nothing else I have to do now. Okay, and this is a 4-week process compared to 7-month composting that I'm used to. So taking that fermentation path allows me to really break down the food waste and then be able to grow right on top of that. So in Japan, they have these bokashi buckets, and then the city collects the food waste because, of course, they don't have garden space. But then the bokashi is turned into a special kind of a ball, which is sent back out to farmers because it's so nutrient dense and fermented. So these are ways you could close the, I mean, we're throwing away 50% of our food waste, right? So when you think about like, okay, what else can we do with it? You can see where I can build a complete farm. Imagine making rows like this now from just the waste coming out of a community and planting right on top. That means we're making $1 in a month without trucking in things. And that soil is going to stay rich a long time. So these are techniques that this is what really got me. And I'm doing this at home. So when I start doing this at home, I start realizing like, all right, I'm creating free garden, but then my own health, I start realizing like, what am I putting in the bucket? Because you start putting Taco Bell in that bucket, right? And fast food, and you want to try to grow the best tomatoes, you realize like, all right, this is connected, and it starts to waking up a lot of things. The school gardens, we were able to do completely, the complete school garden for K-5 without spending $1 because I was trapping the food waste. And kids throw away all their apples first, right? All their good food gets tossed first. So you can see where then you can create a lot of good food systems based on refuse through fermentation. That Topaz farm, when we have all the excess pumpkins, I can't do it in buckets. So you can see I have the tractor come out and dig me a big hole. If you have a lot of refuse, you may be able to do this on your property, but I would dig a big hole, add in the probiotic inoculant, add in the bokashi, and then I can cover that up. And you have your breakdown happening right there in the soil, right? So these are great ways. Like you can even, if you're collecting community waste, these are things that you can create your own farms by using these techniques. And then on the right side, you see Adam. He's just tossing out bokashi out on the greenhouse, and this is just going to boost the microorganisms of the soil on top of that leaf litter there. Yeah, so the soil food web, when we're talking about bacteria and fungi, they really are like the precursors for then the next step, which another indicator species. When we see the mushrooms, right? When we start doing these kinds of organic farming and then we see the mushrooms, we don't even know what they are half the time, but you can tell like, wow, my land must be happy. So there's a lot of the next step for me, since I've been doing probiotic farming for so long, and I'm seeing all these mushrooms, and I'm realizing like, all right, this stuff's hand in hand. There's certain species of mushrooms that are like the bulldozers, and you can do the heavy work and also create food. So when I discovered working with the wine cap mushroom and how I can just put those in the wood chips, which are already doing rows and footpaths, right? But then create food and the soil breakdown properties of them. This is the next step. So regenerative farming, we're starting to inoculate, just like I do with the bokashi. We're adding in the wine caps into your wood chips. We're able to provide these services through ground culture to get yourself going on things like this, but they're going to fix the soil and they're going to create a lot of food at the same time. So, the microorganisms, I couldn't really see what was happening to eat off of them, but these fruiting bodies now are providing a lot of health benefits. So these are the kind of things now as we think about, well, we're laying the wood chip down. Well, let's think about planting some food in there too. Think of these particular species that you can get in there that are going to do that bulldozing work to handle the remediation. Now, the bokashi, being fermented organic matter, these things, we don't just use them for fermenting food waste. These are super cool for bioremediation projects. And if you look online, you'll see they're called Bokashi Balls, but they're basically mud mixed with the bokashi. And what's happening when you have the mud from your particular site that you want to make better is that site, that mud, has its own microorganisms that are specific to there. Okay. So then when I mix it with the bokashi and make that little ball, it's like having a meeting. There's what they call intercellular communication between microbes where they talk to each other. And being that the the Bokashi microbes don't want to take over, they really want to work with the indigenous microbes from your mud to figure out how to make things better. As I said, if we were to slide these things later, you can't even find them. So when we do these Bokashi balls, they're able to then incorporate the beneficial microbes from the EM with your mud, and then you're able to restore a lot of water. When we look at all of the efforts being done by USDA, it's the indigenous microbes that seem to work the best, the ones from your land, not the ones that we bring in. It's not like I put the EM or something and it works good. It's the ones that are already there. They just sometimes need a little help. But these Bokashi balls now have become, they're a global movement. And these things are rolled all over the world. And they're able to fix waterways because they're enlisting those native microbes in partnership with the probiotics. But this thing has so much traction going on, and it's something that involves to get done. Look at community, right? Something that's done by everybody, organized by the academic society. So when we're doing these kind of events and everybody's involved, that's really how I feel the work's going to get done. It ain't a sideline kind of a game right now. You know, we've done too much damage. This kind of thing where we can, and not only that, it empowers people. If you could just grab mud and this component and roll this on your own time and go down with your friends and put it in the water, I'm telling you, you're about to have the best day. You are about to really have a good day. So this movement here, I mean, this is first like 20 years ago. This is just crazy talk, right? Nobody really knew, but now MIT is involved, and MIT is really partnered with doing things with the Bokashi balls and the effective microbes. They're creating these amazing barriers that are trapping in pollutants. So when we get the attention of the major colleges, or things that we just kind of, like I said, I started this in my backyard. I was a bucket fermenter. It was with the school I was throwing the balls in, right? It's either I've gone fully crazy thinking these microbes are going to help, or then you see this kind of thing where MIT's involved and you realize like it's a collaboration effort now. It really takes the backyard people, and we really got to work with agency now. And this is exactly how it's going to get done. So this conference here, you can check online. There's some beautiful things on there on watershed restoration, as well as land restoration, using all the technologies that we talked about, but at different speed. You know, when we discovered all this biochar and things 20 years ago, it was Japan they took it to a different level. So it's a very interesting talk. I advise you to all go take a look at. And then the USDA currently is giving away char, and they're partnering with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Last year, we were trying to find farms like giving this thing away. And it was amazing at how many people did not jump on free biochar because the thing's expensive. So now this year, they even added in the installation of the thing. So these are the kind of things I want you to check their programs so that you can get to the biochar. You use it at very little cost because it is expensive, but you can see like who's involved now. And it's like, you know, building a house without a building code when you start building farms without these particular components. So these are the kinds of things now where you can see the tribal knowledge is merging with agency to promote these good things to keep us going for many more years to come. Yeah, so check those out. And if you're interested in any of the workshops that we have going on, we got free ones happening up in the reservation in Cuauhtemoc, California. We're going to be rolling the Bokashi balls with the native community up there. And then we have a gardening with microbe workshop on April 22nd. That's where we're going to teach you how to do the wine caps in your gardens. We have spawn available. And that's May 6th. And then gardening with mushrooms is going to be April 22nd. So check our website. You'll see a few workshops there. One could appeal to you. If you need scholarships and can't afford, send us an email and we'll make sure that you get in. I think that about wraps up the spiel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cuauhtemoc. So much so much valuable, fascinating knowledge you shared that I think many of us have heard trickles of here and there, and some of it might have initially sounded like crazy talk, to use your term. It's really wonderful to have an expert to dive a bit deeper into the roles of probiotic cultures that exist in our soils and in our foods, in our guts, and the relationships between macro life and microbe life and microbe communication. Yeah, anyway, I'm very much looking forward to our Q&A. But first, we are going to give our speaker a break, and we're going to sort you into breakout groups for around 10 minutes or so. And during that time, we'd love you to address 2 questions, which I will also make sure to add to the chat for reference. First being, what are some things that struck or surprised you about Cuauhtemoc's presentation? And then what questions do you have for Cuauhtemoc? And so in your group, we'd love if you would discuss some of those questions and then choose one and designate one person in your group to type it into the chat as we reconvene. So please stick around and we'll see you back here in 10 or so minutes. Okay, Cuauhtemoc, are you ready for some questions?
Yes.
All right. Is there any effort in our community to utilize all the food we put into our yard waste bins? And if not, how can we get this going?
Yeah, so as you saw the larger example at Topaz, that we dealt with large amounts of food waste. Pit composting may be a way to deal with it, but we've had great success in like 275-gallon totes. So it depends how big of a community you have contributing, and I'm sure that will grow over time. But trying to figure out like what's my starting point, where do we think this is going to end? It may require several styles of methods before you find what works. But what will work is a lot of the times when we do these big, large composting is they get mad of the leachates coming out of the site. So if we take the fermentation path, you won't have those distributions of concern that the agencies are worried about. So it's definitely a style you want to employ no matter how you go about it, so that we stay within regulations.
Hypothetically, we have some questions about biochar. So hypothetically, if I take biochar from someplace else and add it to my specific site, will it work as well as if I use hyperlocal plant materials and microbes?
Gauging from the way the fires have been lately, so hot and the way they burn, I'm going to say that char is probably usable. But you got to make sure it's a high temperature char, so there's less residuals of volatile compounds within the biomass structure, which means like when I showed you that honeycomb structure picture, if it wasn't hot enough, those little holes will be filled up, and then you won't be able to get the little microbes inside just yet. But when it gets really hot, then the honeycomb, all those volatile gas pockets release, then you have the char we're looking for the regenerative work done, which I talked about. But I mean, it could work.
Does biochar preserve more bacteria than the natural buried compost? For example, German hugelkultur.
100%. 100%, because when we look at the soil food web, where we kind of left off, hugelkultur is amazing, but where we left off was like these new microbes that we call electron-loving microbes, which are before the soil food web. So that's the part Elaine Ingham hasn't touched base yet on. But there's these like little Jedi microbes, and they take on electrons and give off electrons. And what's cool about learning about those is when we're dealing with like some of those forever chemicals, if we can give them the electron zap, then we then make them inert, and then they don't move through biological systems. So that's what's so important about that little worm microbe I was talking about, that purple non-sulfur. Some of these microbes can zap things so that it makes things inert. It doesn't quite consume it, but it keeps it in a state where they don't move through the system. So there's a ton of electron-loving microbes we're just learning about now that is baffling microbiology.
Awesome. A couple questions about kombucha. First of all, why kombucha? And then I have a couple of add-ons to that. Do you personally brew your own kombucha? And then do you have any recommendations for like store brand kombucha?
So I wanted to show you the kombucha. So it wasn't that I'm just trying to sell you a product and know you can make it yourself. Yes, I do make my own kombucha. So I know that those are going to be super special. And like I said, when we look at the way microbes react, the more they interact with the person, it seems like the better they perform. It's very strange that way. But that's why I use the kombucha, to show you like how you can just do it yourself. You can buy the probiotic cultures, or you can just make teas from the worm castings and the kombuchas. So there are going to be better kombuchas than others, and that depends on how they're processed and made. But I would look at the more interactive that brewer is with that booch, is going to mean the more active those microbes are.
Can you provide us an example of soil where you saw the most change from degradation to more restored, healthier soil?
Okay, Napa River 8 years ago, we made 350 of those Bokashi Balls and put them in with the school kids on Earth Day. And I'm thinking, what's this going to do? This is a big river, ain't going to do nothing. Napa River's full of silt, and the riverbank is just silt everywhere. So we put all the balls in, and I came back like 2 weeks later to see how it was, if I could see anything, any kind of change. And what amazed me was I could finally see on the tips of the riverbank a 1/4 inch of rock. The tip of the rocks were showing. Now the microbes started to digest the silt. It's food source for them, right? And they release it back into the aquatic systems, fulvic acids, amino acids. They're just digesting the thing. So I'm like, wait, no way. Maybe it was high tide or something, right? Maybe that's what made the water push. So I come back again 2 weeks later, 1/2 inch. 2 weeks after that, completely rock showing. So now we still go to Napa River. The tule grass has come back on that whole water. There was nothing there before. It was all silt and sediment all the time. So I was able to see the microbes within about a 2-month change digest the silt from the aquatic system, and really inspired me that, hey, I can do this with some school kids. What if we got more people involved? What can we do?
Kind of on a wider scale, wider picture, how can community members make a difference in the way soil is managed on the agricultural and food production system level?
Every time you buy something, it's like voting. Where you spend your dollar, you're giving resources to those people to continue doing the good work. So, finding out your local farmers markets, and it's like interviewing people, finding out how they're taking care of land, what their missions are. Man, we can't do it without the resources. So that means your vote. So without you guys voting for us saying, hey, do a good job, then it's all gonna peter out. So the biggest thing that we can do as a movement is supporting the farmers and those in the community doing the work that we appreciate, because then you know how your dollar was spent. Sometimes we spend our dollars somewhere else, we don't know where it ends up. So making those connections fuels the work that we want to see done within our community. And there's some amazing growers in our community we have no idea about. They're not loudmouths like me. You're not going to hear about them. But there's just amazing farmers doing good things, growing plants and seeds in a good way. So I encourage you to look around, go to your farmers markets, meet them, say hello, and see what's happening, and vote with your dollar.
Can you tell us a bit more about your work with Portland Bureau of Environmental Services and the work you've been doing around bioswales and adding soil amendments to those bioswales?
Okay, so I'm in the gutters of Portland. I'm down in the rain gardens, and the rain gardens is catchment it's like a toilet bowl for the city. Everything drains into those things. So we're trying to rely on the native plants to clean that up with different mediums. But me, as knowing what I know about microorganisms and how they can digest a lot of these compounds that the normal mediums can't. And in the biochar, I mean, who filters water without charcoal, right? And there's no such thing. So when I learned, like, okay, we have these amazing systems around city of Portland, how can we boost them up? I was on the irrigation team, And we would fill up a 500-gallon water tank maybe 10, 12 times a day. So I would then put the microorganisms in that water tank and inoculate all of the rain gardens with that. So they basically have the purple non-sulfur bacteria, the yeast, all throughout our community. And a lot of these sites are sites where the native plants cannot take the loads coming in. The worms are white. There's like, there's a lot of petrochemicals headed into the rain gardens in some of these parts of Portland. But when we're able to put a microbe in that looks at petrochemical as a food, right? And not only that, it nurtures those endophytes within those native plants that are in the swales, because those native plants have their own little special microbes that they need nurtured in order to live. So my little microbes are just feeding those guys. That gives them that little leg up to then kind of thrive. So we put in the microbes, and then Portland's really big on biochar right now. So they're adding in biochar to different parts for moisture testing currently, but then, it's going to advance on into water quality and things like that. So these are the kind of things where we need the community to kind of just keep rooting them on, keep urging them to do the things. But when you work with the agency, it takes years. It takes 1 year to get the grant, then 1 year to implement, so there's like a lot of things that take a long time that happen. But with community support and knowledge of like, hey, we know about that. It's always the younger people within the agency that are pushing this thing through. Older people seem like they're just about to retire and they know it's good, but maybe don't want to get into that right now. It's kind of the younger people who are just like, wow, what can we do? What can we do? So we have to kind of like encourage everybody to be like, this is a community thing. This is what's happening, and big them up like it's their idea when it's happening, and they'll keep doing more, and that's really how we move forward.
So those Bokashi balls, are those conducive to stormwater basins? Do you have those too?
No, they haven't never added those per se. My partner and I, ground culture, we add them all the time to just any stormwater that we go around. So it's not something that they have on the schedule. We're hoping they do now that MIT, as I talked about earlier, has a lot of work with the probiotic mud balls. These are the things where Portland's so innovative. Somebody's going to jump on that. Somebody from one of the water agencies is going to be like, what? A mud ball? Are you kidding me? This is community connection plus actually science connecting to remediate water. Next steps, y'all invite and make a party, and we're rolling mud balls with everybody. So this is what makes it so good. It's like in that moment where like it can really go full speed now, because it satisfies everybody from grassroots side to academic side. And now we need those who manage to then orchestrate it so that we can roll the balls and get it done.
Are you rolling a lot of these balls with schools? Do you have a lot of student engagement?
Yeah, that's how it all started, is education. This is just recently did I do it business wise, but for the past 20 years, even talking about microbes, people look at you like an alien, right? So it really became like an educational thing. And I realized the educational side was really where it was at until like currently, now I can finally move it into something that can be business sense. But when I did business on microbes 6 years ago, and I'm in Napa Valley doing this thing, people are just kind of like, oh man, they weren't really sure about soil microbes, even though they were in farming. It was really like the cannabis community who was the ones heavily engaged in soil ecological sense, but it wasn't the wine community where I thought I was going to be hitting that. So now's the time, I think, for more resources to be done for business sense, but it's always been education. I've always done it in schools. I have a ton of videos online doing it in schools. And it's because I need the kids to go home and tell their parents. They're not going to hear from me, right? I need the kids. The kids in the vineyards are the ones who were crying because a sprayer was running, and they'd be crying about killing microbes, where their dad's like, what is Timmy talking about bacteria for? What's going on in your class? And the kids are crying because they're killing bacterias, right? But these are the things where the parents miss, but the kids can then tell them, which they got the parents to talk to me. But the point is the kids are the ones that take it home and really make the impact. And that's what we're doing it for. We're doing this to save our planet for the children. So working with them is exactly the momentum I need. It's not the adults that give me the momentum. It's the kids, for sure.
So for those adults in the room that want to get their hands on these Bokashi balls, there are some good links in the chat that you can use to purchase Cuauhtemoc's Bokashi balls and from Ground Culture PDX. So be sure to check that out. Okay, couple of other questions. What particular characteristics in a fire pit or kiln are needed to produce biochar?
Okay, so I'm looking for like a cone shape down at the bottom where things kind of like come into a cone and then up, and that seems to reduce the oxygen coming into the fire. But straight up, I've done a thing in a barbecue pit, and it's you know, you can do smaller burns in barbecue pits. So you're more looking for a bottom that's kind of rounded down that will reduce oxygen coming to the burn, if that helps at all.
What size wood do you use generally?
I have to use all sides because we're doing fuel reductions and we're doing, you know, pruning and things like that. But if you were to have different size woods, I usually layer my smaller woods down at the bottom, making them maybe a 2 to 3 foot pile. And then on top of that, my bigger rounds are going to go on top of the smaller sticks, and then small sticks on top of the big rounds. So I can get a really good heat from the top to get the middle. You're like making a sandwich, right? With the big rounds, with your bigger pieces. Then you can get the top burning, and when that gets cooking, it can light that middle up. But then by the time it gets to those bottom sticks, which are going to ignite super hot, I can make sure that I have good conversion with those big rounds. So there are tricks. If you also check in your moisture content of your wood, being about a 15 to 22% moisture content, you can buy a meter, I think, to like $30. But because we're Pacific Northwest, wet wood's a problem, but staying within that range, it converts very fast. So that may be helpful for you when dealing with big pieces of wood, getting it to that 15 to 20% moisture range for combustion.
Okay. And is the smoke ever a big problem? Do you have any advice on how to?
Yeah, so as I showed you, when I do the top light, the smoke that traditionally goes up into the air hits the flame. The heat draws in the smoke, and smoke we don't realize is actually fuel. So with the more it's smoking down at the bottom, it means the more fuel my flame is going to be getting, and the more flame that it gets, the more fuel it gets, the hotter it's going to become. So the smoke, if I do the top light, is actually my ally and not my enemy. And this is where the air quality districts now are looking at top light. We call it the conservation burn, and all of those kilns, they're able to be used now in California on no burn days because the combustibles, which usually go up into the air, are now being captured and combusted, that it reduces it down to 96, 98%. So top light that fire, that's where we're going to capture the smoke and have it help us out.
How can we get involved with volunteering on Topaz Farm?
Topaz does not have volunteers, but over at Wapato Island Farm, which is our partner farm, if you look on our website, we have volunteer days twice a week. So Wapato Island Farm, you're more than welcome to join in on one of the work parties we have there.
We'll make sure to add that link to our post notes. Full of other questions. How can we implement a pet manure on more of an urban level? Is there a sustainable way of using a pet manure?
Yeah, so Bokashi is used for animal waste. Then since it goes down a fermentation path and not its traditional breakdown, it's going to have a completely different composite. So look up Bokashi and animal waste treatment, and you'll see a couple different ways depending on what animal you have and the amount of waste that you have, that I know will be able to help you deal with that and make it beneficial. But take it through a different breakdown process of fermentation, makes it a completely different end product.
Great. I'm just going through the chat to make sure that I addressed everyone's questions. Okay, so someone asking for some clarification if you are looking to rotate crops and animals on land in the future, could you spread biochar after harvest and before bringing animals onto that plot of land and still capture that gas sequestering and health benefits?
Yeah, 100%. Highly encouraged. Having the animals drop on top of there is exactly what we're looking for. They're going to have their unique microbiome. They're going to contribute, and then it's going to absorb to the char and hold instead of running off with the water. So it will stay longer within the soil. Excuse me. Where char was discovered in the Amazon, it rains a lot there. I didn't realize you can't really grow food because all the rain like washes all the nutrients away. So the only way to provide the food for the millions of people, of indigenous people, you had to grow it with char. And that's exactly what caused Cornell University to go down and look at the site, because they're like, wait, how can you grow food even in the Amazon? The nutrients wash away. So it's very sticky. So it's going to hold all the nutrients from your animals and all your amendments in the soil.
If you buy compost from like the Portland Municipal Facility, can you roll Bokashi balls from that?
So it probably won't stick because the compost is a different. It sticks differently because it's more soil-like. So you may want to add a little bit of clay. So you need soil that's going to hold together in a ball form. So I don't imagine that is going to hold together, but you can mix that with some of your backyard soil, and I think that would be a good idea. And what I like about that, it's going to introduce the good microbes to that compost you're going to use. And who knows what that compost could be, right? It's coming from City of Portland, but it's going to have a sense of like what's in it, so then they can gauge its microbial colonies to deal with that issue. So good idea.
All right, so I think I've addressed the questions in the chat. Do you have any last words, Cuauhtemoc, that you'd like to share with us before I close out?
I just want to thank all you guys for taking your evening to hear all of this. My gosh, this is amazing. And thank you, Allie, for once you heard it, you wanted to spread it to everyone here tonight. So my goodness, this thing spreads by word of mouth and by big smiles, which we all seem to be wearing right now. And so let's keep it going. Let's keep it going. And I hope we can one day roll balls together. I would love for all of us to check the website, because we are going to do these drop-ins where we're going to invite people just to come join us and roll balls and talk about these things. So I consider you guys new friends, community members, and part of my particular tribe now for water protection. And I thank you guys all so much.
Thank you so much, Cuauhtemoc. You bring so much warmth and enthusiasm, so much contagious enthusiasm to this conversation. And we are super blessed to have you. Just some closing remarks. I love that you mentioned soil your undies in your presentation, as well as the idea from Korean natural farming and burying that partially cooked rice as sort of like a bioindicator. Love that. If you were super intrigued and compelled by that and would like to try it out in your own backyard in Lake Oswego, Oswego Lake Watershed Council has you covered. We have a campaign, a Soil Your Undies campaign of our own that we've adopted from Oregon farmers. And each spring we hand out brand new pairs of cotton briefs to the Lake Oswego community. And the whole idea is that you bury it in your backyard for 2 months, 60 days, like Cuauhtemoc mentioned. And at the end of that time frame, we have everyone dig up the undies and display the results of those 2 months that the undies spent marinating underground. So the whole idea is that the healthier your soil is, the more biodegraded the undies are, with those microorganism communities eating away the cotton. So if that sounds fun to you, I highly recommend you take the challenge, and you can hit us up at this Saturday's Sustainability Resource Fair at Lake Ridge Middle School. That's from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then you can also find us the following Saturday, Earth Day, at Lusher Farm from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. And you can register for that on our website, which I will put in the chat, and also we will have in our follow-up notes. And yeah, Thanks everyone for coming here and participating in this. Thank you to Cuauhtemoc. Thank you, OCRF. Keep an eye out for the email of the recording and the links. And yeah, it's really wonderful to convene here and talk soil. And yeah,
Bye, everybody. Have a good night.
see y'all.